Hello, everyone. My name is Chris Corley. I'm Interim Dean of Library and Learning at Minnesota State Mankato. Thank you for joining us today. Today's session is a community listening session. It's the first of 4 sessions that are dedicated to responding to community concerns and our ongoing commitment to professional program review, where our university is inviting you to a town hall listening session on our review of current criminal justice programs, including the educational programs of peace officers and correction officers. By way of introduction, Dr. Pat Nelson, the department chair of our Department of Government, will talk about today's session before we have our conversation.
Thank you for joining us. We're very excited to have you here. So the purpose of our listening session, it has many facets to it. First of all, President Davenport really wanted us to take some time this summer and dive into what our curriculum is in our criminal justice programs at Minnesota State University Mankato. And also, we wanted to demonstrate our commitment to the community. All of our programs undergo program review every 5 years, and this is the first time we've invited the community to have a voice in our program review and to give us feedback on our curriculum. Again, we do have 3 criminal justice programs. We have the corrections program, the criminal justice program, and law enforcement program, and we'll tell you a little bit about each of those before we get to questions. And I do just want to caution, we are focusing on education, curriculum, and higher education. We're not going to be doing any discussion of any specific events or cases that have occurred in the nation or the world. So by way of introduction, I'm going to have each one of the panelists introduce themselves.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Still good morning. My name is Matt Loiza. I'm the Dean of the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences here at Minnesota State Mankato. My career at MSU began back in 2003 when I was hired as a professor in the history department. There I taught a bunch of courses on U.S. history, mainly related to U.S. foreign relations. Served as interim dean in 2018, 2019, and last year dropped the interim from the title, so now it's just dean. I'm serving on this work group because law enforcement, corrections, and criminal justice are all programs in the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences. Part of my role as dean is talking and working with the faculty on curricular revisions and development in all of those programs. So welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name's Henry Morris, the Vice President of Diversity and Inclusion. I'm also a member of the President's Cabinet, Senior Leadership Advisory Group to the President. And as Pat said, we've been having conversations at Cabinet and Council of Deans for a while on what was happening in the nation and what role that we felt that we could do to be part of changes if that was decided was needed. I also, as you can probably tell, I'm an African-American male, so I have some personal interest in the discussion that we're having. So I look forward to these listening sessions to hear what we need to hear about how Minnesota State University can be part of the solution and not obviously just part of anybody's problem.
And I'm Pat Nelson. You've probably heard me or seen me talking about law enforcement. I joined Minnesota State University Mankato in 2012 as a faculty member of the law enforcement program and came from a professional position here in Minnesota as a law enforcement officer. I have a deep passion for law enforcement. I'm actually a 5th generation law enforcement officer in my family. I'm also the chair of the Department of Government that houses several programs, including political science, urban and regional studies, law enforcement, and criminal justice. I serve as the program director specifically for law enforcement and criminal justice. And I love to instill in my students the passion for being a part of the community with law enforcement and criminal justice. And I'm really excited to hear what you have to give us for information about our programs.
Hi, I'm Dr. Sharice Truesdale Moore. I'm Associate Professor of Corrections in the Department of Sociology and Corrections. I'm the past director of the Corrections Program. My former experience, I ran a correctional program for the state of Maryland. late 1900s. And I formerly was employed at the U.S. Attorney's Office in Division of Narcotics. I look forward to hearing some of the things that you have to say. I came here in 2004, and some of the courses that I've taught have been juvenile delinquency, intro to criminal justice, correctional counseling, social deviance, cultural competency in corrections. I've done study abroad and to study at in South Africa, the criminal justice system there. And I've also taught race and juvenile justice. So I look forward to hearing some of the things that you have to offer our curriculum.
The next step in our introduction, we just want to really give you a brief overview of the programs to show you what we are currently teaching in there, because it might help answer some questions and generate some ideas. So I'm going to turn this back over to Dr. Truesdale Moore to talk about corrections.
Okay, so first I would like to share with you the intent or purpose of our program. So the corrections program was designed to prepare students for entry-level professional work in corrections. The major is built upon a foundation of general education, sociology, and criminological concepts, and a commitment to understanding and transforming the correctional practice. So what we hear today is very important. The major achieves its objectives through the melding of academic learning with experiential education. This program is further expected to promote within corrections and to community at large a commitment to the principles of social justice, respect, tolerance, dignity, and worth of all persons. So our students, when they first come into our program, they usually are taking very intro classes that will be juvenile delinquency, foundations, and orientation. Foundation is to introduce you to some of the things that we can offer into our program, whether it be nonprofit or an agency of some kind, but give you some experience in touching on the discipline in some sort. Juvenile delinquency, of course, it speaks for itself, and also the justice system and the theoretical practices behind understanding the behavioral issues. And then, and our JOLT program is a really fascinating program where it actually has our students connected with probation officers who are working with youth who are on probation, and they are assigned, one of our students is assigned to one of the kids on probation, and we help them through the probation process. They have different activities that they may do with the youth. They may talk to teachers, they may talk to someone in the community that they have interaction with, but they also work closely with the probation officer in the daily tasks of what they do. So other types of courses are usually on the 400, what we call the 400 level is usually at the junior and senior level. And that's where we are actually digging into our major to understand the applied approaches to working. Evidence, what is the best evidence out there that tells us how to best to work with the population into the community. Other types of classes that we have to take, like correctional law, that introduces to legal issues within the correctional system. But the interesting thing about one of my courses is that I teach cultural competency in corrections, where there I'm teaching students how to look at the humanity of the offender or the at-risk person that they are working with. That it examines their own awareness. We look at skills, and we start to build knowledge and building intervention practices that intersect with evidence-based practices. So I don't know where I should go from here, because I could go on and talk about each course, but I tried to give you an interesting aspect or a lens into what we do in our program.
I'm going to move us on to the criminal justice program, because Charisse and I worked very hard on this to get this program at Minnesota State University Mankato. There had been people working on it before us, but we were the ones that finally got it approved, and this is just the second year of our criminal justice program. The criminal justice degree is a little bit different than the law enforcement and the corrections degree, but we blend in classes from both of them. There is a wide range of occupations, careers, associated networks with criminal justice, so it's much more than police and corrections. As you can see, we do a blend of corrections and law enforcement courses. It is a little difficult to decipher this layout on the screen. I admit that is one of the things that we are still working on to make it a little bit smoother, but we do have some common core courses that include ethics and leadership, criminal law and procedure, research, and understanding drugs and society. We also include a cultural competency piece where they can choose between the law enforcement, policing, and a diverse society course, or the cultural competency in corrections course. We make them spend time on theory such as criminology and victimology, and then we try to tailor electives into their interest in the criminal justice system. Charisse, am I missing anything?
Nope.
And then our law enforcement program. So our law enforcement program is accredited by the Minnesota Peace Officer Standards and Trainings Board. We are an official professional peace officer education program. Minnesota, you have to have at least a 2-year degree to become licensed as a peace officer. We're the largest 4-year program in the state. And we always encourage our students to get a 4-year degree, not just because they get to spend more time with us in the classroom, but they get a lot more maturity, more critical thinking, more decision making in those final 2 years at the university. And that's kind of what we promote. So as you can see, there's a lot of law enforcement classes. We have a lot of post-learning objectives we have to meet. And we really have it divided into 2 sections. Our lower division 100 and 200 classes, we consider the core basic classes. And these are also ones that they would get in a 2-year program. And then our 300 and 400 level classes are those where we spend a lot more time, more in depth on theory, practical application, and real world scenarios. One of our highlights is that we've been teaching a policing and a diverse society class for the last 20 years. We moved it from the 200 level up into our junior level about 3 years ago because we wanted to spend more time there. And I know it might sound weird that we have a class called Law Enforcement Mindset, but that was the best title we could come up with for psychologically preparing them to communicate and work in law enforcement. So we can talk about individual classes if you have questions. We have course descriptions as well on the website, but I really want to be able to have more time for questions for the community. So if you have any specific questions, just let us know. One more thing before we get into questions is we are asking for additional members to be a part of our criminal justice program review work group. We're looking for some community partners and subject matter experts, and we'll be meeting over Zoom starting in August. Right now, we don't have quite the email address you can send your letter of interest to, but we are looking for people that are interested in participating, and we'll get that information out probably in a press release and on our website here soon. So the structure of today, you could submit your questions via email to events@mnsu.edu, but since you're here on in our listening session, we would prefer if you submitted your questions via the Q&A button, which is on the bottom on your screen probably, or by raising your hand. If you raise your hand, we will get you in the order that people raise their hands. We will limit your question to 1 minute. You will be muted until your question is asked, and then we'll mute you again, just so that we can respond without getting a lot of feedback. If you have additional questions, you can just raise your hand. We will remind you that we are just focused on education here, so we will stay within those boundaries. So at that, I think I will turn it back over to Chris. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We did have some questions that were submitted to us ahead of time. So I think what we'll do is start with a few of those while our audience is preparing their own questions. And feel free again to use the Q&A or to raise your hand, and we'll get to you when we're able to do so. So why don't we start with Dr. Nelson. Why don't we start with you with the first question, which is, are students taught to consider their career in law enforcement as a way to protect and serve through community connections and outreach?
So I will start by saying yes, and you'll probably see that I'll share the program layouts as we're talking and answering questions here. We do not do what is called fear-based training. We are focused really, we start them off in a class called Law Enforcement and Community Relations right in their freshman year, and we keep carrying that through. We talk about human behavior, we talk about diverse societies, we talk about psychologically preparing yourself, we have a stress course. So yes, that is a common theme that you hear from all of our faculty members, is that we are community members. There is no us versus them. We are all part of the community, and you should be thinking as people as your neighbors, not the enemies. So that is a very strong thing that we try to teach.
Okay, we'll go with another question here. Potentially Dean Loiza, if you would like to answer this question. It's a more broad question, but what can we do as educators to change the direction that policing has taken?
I think what we're continually trying to do here at Minnesota State Mankato is to always review our programs on a regular basis, whether or not that's criminal justice, law enforcement, corrections, or considering the question, all of our other programs such as history, sociology, right on down the line, to really think about how we analyze society in a broad sense, look at how policing fits into the broader society that we live in and participate in. So looking at policing not just under a really tunnel vision, myopic kind of focus, but just look at how it plays into many of the challenges that we're facing as a broader society, and looking to address these inequities on a systemic level and contributing to our broader society. So I think if we can do that and look at this, I think from a holistic point of view, and look at how all of our university programs, gen ed curriculum to majors, can look at these broader questions, and then in turn help prepare the best professionally trained individuals that we can, whether or not they're peace officers, whether or not they're social studies or other educators, engineers, social workers. Then I think we'll be much better prepared to deal with these variety of issues that certainly include law enforcement, when we're talking about, say, systemic racism, but go well beyond that.
Okay, thank you.
Actually, I'd like to jump in on this one too. I think this is part of why we're having this listening session, because when we talk about education and the direction policing is going, I think it's important we find out what those in the community think about our education. What do they think we're doing? What do they think we should be doing? So I would open up to anybody that's on the attendees list. You don't actually necessarily have to have a question for us. You could have a suggestion. You could have an area you think that we should be covering. And maybe we are, maybe we aren't. But really, the sky is the limit here. I'll flat out tell you if we can't do something because it's outside the law. But otherwise, really, the sky is the limit. And that's what we're really looking for, is I want some feedback. How can we help change the direction of policing here?
And I'll just remind you that feel free to put questions in the Q&A and we'll address those, or raise your hand and we can get to your question orally as well.
Chris, can I just piggyback on that a little bit?
Yes.
Again, I think what Matt and Pat shared, I think, is core. Minnesota State Mankato is a state university, I think, has a special relationship between what we do here and the citizens of Minnesota. As a state institution, quite a bit of our budget comes from the state legislature through taxes, again, through the people. And so as Chris said in our opening statement, we are responding to what we heard from the community, and we, as a university, we put out to ourselves, had conversations. How can we be part of this conversation? What role do we have? And well, we teach a lot of the people that become officers in corrections. So are we teaching all the things that make them better employees in those environments in the foundational level when they come out of our program? Are we doing the best that we can do to make them the best people that they can be in the communities that they get hired into? And so, you know, we have some questions about that. We see what's happening. We read the newspapers. We see all those interesting things. And so we know we have a special role. We're not just innocent bystanders looking at it. We have an active role in trying to make a difference, not the only role, and maybe not even the most important role, but we know we have a role. And so that's why we're here to listen and to see what we're missing. Because sometimes when you're part of the forest, you can't see all the trees. And so that's why we really call in these listening sessions for you to share with us what you may be seeing from your perspectives that we might be able to have the ability to impact and make a difference in as we go forward.
Thank you very much, Vice President Morris. The next question, perhaps I'll direct to Dr. Truesdale Moore. And that's a question about the kinds of education that our students have about working with people who have physical or mental disabilities. The person writing asked specifically about schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. Could you describe how our students are, what kind of experience they have with that education? You're muted.
Okay. All right, so there are a couple of courses that we have in our program, correctional counseling, that actually we don't teach from the perspective of maybe someone in a mental health program or a psychology program. We look at it in terms of how that particular disorder affects how or impacts their interaction with law enforcement or particularly probation. We see it in terms of what does this disorder consist of that creates different types of behaviors that may impact how someone sees you, reacts to you, and then at the same time, what are the best interventions or programs that we can put in place to make sure that we have the best types of outcomes. So some of the exercises, one of the exercises that we do is I have them to research a disorder and come back to class. And this is not a lecture pointing to the board type of lecture. This is a lecture where they come and they present the issues about, for example, schizophrenia. And then after that short presentation, we're usually in group settings, sitting down, and no one standing up, pointing to the board. Like I said, they present that information. Then the students will take notes as they hear what is happening with that particular disorder. And then my conversation, as I facilitate the conversation, is what will be the interaction, or what are some of the issues that you think that are important that a probation officer should know about? So does it mean that In some disorders, you may be depressed a lot. In some disorders, you may be hyperactive. In some disorders, you might have to have medication to manage you. And, you know, I can go on and on. But at the same time, once we understand what those attributes are, those characteristics of the disorder, then it's not necessarily about resistance. You know, why should I just immediately go to my docket, my file, and say, this person resisted? No, this person has problems remembering his appointments. How can we put something in place that challenge that kind of response, or build better programming so that he makes it to his probation officer, meets with him regularly, or we make sure he gets up on time and gets to his program? Or if he's acting out in his program, what are some of those issues that we need to, is group setting the best place for him, or should we do an individual setting? So it's those kinds of conversations that we have in a classroom that gives them some insight on how to work with someone with those with various types of disorders.
And I'll jump in on here. So on the law enforcement side, we do spend quite a bit of time going over the different types and categories, not only of mental illnesses, but also maybe injuries, substance abuse, anything that might impact normal communication, normal, I'll put quotes around that, normal communications with somebody. So we actually start that in law enforcement and human behavior. We continue it in law enforcement mindset. In fact, the first 8 weeks of that course is spent on communications, de-escalation, active listening, and mental illness. And they do even role playing, where they're role playing some interactions in a safe environment so they can get feedback. Now, our interaction on the law enforcement side with people that have mental illness usually come in two categories. They're either in crisis or they need some assistance. So we also spend quite a bit of time on suicide intervention. As somebody who has some extensive experience with crisis intervention, I always start off with my students telling them, how do we start a conversation with somebody who's mentally ill? And they usually look at me, it's like the same way you start a conversation with anybody else, because that's true. Most law enforcement officers do not know they're dealing with somebody who's mentally ill, and the mental illness may have no impact whatsoever on the call. So could we spend more time on that? Absolutely. I could probably spend every day, every semester for 5 semesters trying to teach this to somebody. But it's a skill you have to continually use and build. But it's something we need to definitely lay the foundation for in education.
Thank you. We are receiving some questions coming in from our audience. So I'll start from the top. Some of the questions relate to one another. But the first question is, in what course do students learn about the history of law enforcement as a profession? Specifically, the ways police have been used to enforce oppressive laws, like Jim Crow laws. The historical context of the profession seems key to help future officers understand some of the lack of trust people have toward the institution of policing.
So you actually have 2 classes that answer this. The very history of law enforcement, going back to like Sir Robert Peel back in England and our Magna Carta, we start that in Introduction to Criminal Justice. So everybody in all 3 programs get this. But you know, the specific ways police have used enforced law to be oppressive, that's kind of our policing in a diverse society. And I'll admit, I actually have a law enforcement degree that I don't remember having any of that. So I think it's really good that we have it. Do we need more? I think one of my suggestions, and I hope it's something I also hear from the community, is maybe we need more of it from a different voice outside of law enforcement. That might be one of our suggestions for a curriculum change. And what do you guys think? Do we need it?
Vice President Morris, did you want to speak to that issue?
Yeah, I think it's an important, I think history is an important thing because it helps people to understand why some communities may see police as to protect and serve, and some may see them as an occupying power. And both truths could be true. And until you can understand the perspectives of both, it is sometimes that's where, you know, the whole issue around certain terminology about is your perspective more right than mine? They're just different. They're not right. How I perceive the police based on how I was raised and interact with them may be different than somebody else. And they're both true for people. And so that's why I do think it's important that people in the criminal justice system understand the different perceptions that people have based on their reality and their history with those people who they're interacting, whether it's a judge, whether it's a police corrections, and a whole bunch. My wife happens to be a probation officer, or used to be. She now supervises them. So we have conversations from that perspective, and you know how she does her role as an African-American woman is different sometimes than what her peers may do. Again, and so that history, I think, is paramount to understanding why people respond differently to police and to correction officers.
And I'm going to jump on here because Jessica also had a very similar question that had just one part that I would like to answer. In our general education component here at the university, history is an option that students can study, but it's their selection. When you start getting into our programs, we have some mandatory history we build into our classes, but does everybody in our program study the same amount of history? No, they don't. Should they? Maybe they should. But then deciding what part of that they should be required to study is a conversation we need to have. So I just wanted to answer Jessica, since we were already on most of her question there. That would the one section that we didn't have. So,
Chris, I could just jump in briefly too. Yeah, I mean, maybe I'm biased because I'm a historian, but I think that everyone should study history, obviously. So, but I think really, you know, there are a variety of programs across the university, you know, many of them in SBS that address related questions on law enforcement. I think one thing to consider is the individual raising the question, you know, clearly understands what Jim Crow is. You know, our entering freshman cohorts don't necessarily know what that's a reference to. So, you know, that's a very important part of the equation. You know, when we think about urban violence, I've covered that in my classes in the 60s. Do we, as we currently do we call those riots? Do we label them as rebellions instead? I think those questions lead themselves to a very different degree of understanding of our history. So I guess what I invite the participants to think about is, yeah, give us some feedback as to what kind of perspectives do you think would be either necessary or helpful to our future curriculum, whether or not that comes from history, sociology, ethnic studies. But, you know, what do you think? What do you want us to include, not just as core disciplines, but topics such as Jim Crow, you know, a whole variety of other things.
Dr. Truesdale, would you like to speak to that issue of elements of history that are in your program?
Right. Teaching the history of around law enforcement is good. However, that is only one small aspect. And the course that I think in our discipline in corrections is social deviance. There's a book I use called All God's Children by Fox Butterfield that talks about the history of violence in America that takes you from the American Revolution on up to present contemporary life of a family. And it includes not only just issues around Jim Crow, but all the nuances that happen and the legal issues that happen around the existence of race and family in this time. I use theory to help explain some of the issues around it. I talk about laws. I talk about the elections that happened in the late 1800s that created separation of state and federal government and what it did for African Americans during Jim Crow. And why, so there's so much information that has to be discussed when you start talking about history. There's so much information. But what I think is important is to zoom in on the conditions that affect what our discipline is all about, whether it be corrections, law enforcement. What are those conditions that create something that give you good or bad outcomes? There's also a documentary on Netflix called 13th. And that gives you a history lesson about why these conditions happen. So I don't want to just zero in on what law enforcement has to do. I think you're missing most of what has to take place in a history lesson to understand what the conditions are or the curriculum that needs to take place, if that makes sense.
Thank you, Dr. Truesdale. We have two related questions, I think, that potentially the program directors can help us respond to. One asks if whether students need to apply to be in any of these programs. If yes, are there personality or psychological screening of the applicants in order to be considered to admission? And a related question, I believe, is how or when does your program talk with students that may not be appropriate for the field of law enforcement, and should they be steered in a different direction? So I guess both questions, ask about the application kind of screening process.
I'll jump on here for the law enforcement program. So they can be admitted to the law enforcement program just as a freshman, but then we get to kind of a block around their junior year where they have to apply for admission to finish the program. And we are bound by some Minnesota statutes that have requirements about a psychological exam and physical exam and some standards there that we have to meet. Those standards do not identify specific personality types though. The standards are that the person is not a danger to themselves or others and will not likely engage in racial profiling. I had to look at the exact language here because I never remember that. And that is at the opinion of the psychologist that meets with the person after they complete I believe it's the MMPI-2. And then from the physical standard is that they don't have any pre-existing injuries or medical restrictions. So we do have those requirements, and we do have to have that documented by medical and psychological professionals. When somebody is hired for a police department, they usually go through a different type of psychological exam. I think the second part of that was, when do we talk to them? If we're finding somebody may struggle in law enforcement, we try to talk to them as soon as possible. What do I mean by that? If they are afraid to communicate with people, if they are telling us they're not comfortable with certain things, if they're displaying anything that we could interpret as simply being racist, homophobic, discriminative behavior, we'll sit down and talk to them. Believe it or not, many of them do not realize they're displaying that behavior. I get that a lot with role playing, where they get into a little bit of a stressful situation and suddenly they are using terms that are not accepted in a classroom. And they don't even realize they're doing it. And then we have to have a much deeper discussion about that. One of the limitations we do have is that we cannot really just tell somebody you can't get a law enforcement degree if they can meet that minimum criteria. Even if as faculty we've sat down and talked to them and said, this is probably not the right fit for you, and why? If they can meet the legal requirements, we can't tell them, no, you can't get this degree. Now, most of those students are weeded out in the hiring process. And it may seem silly that we can't do that, but again, we're bound by legal rules on what our minimum standards are, and then we're bound on other philosophical type of ideas on whether we could tell somebody they can't get a degree or not.
Chris, if I could, well, there's two things, and one is I want to ask the audience something, but the first part of this is that in my discipline, as you study issues around race and counseling issues, there's a Dr. Harold Neighbors out of the University of Michigan. I don't know if he's retired now, but he does a lot on Blacks and psychology. And in his research, and you can Google much, he's well established in the discipline, but in his research, he talks about African Americans being more likely to be misdiagnosed. So when we look at law enforcement and issues around saying, okay, this person, and a psychologist is saying this person has some mental health challenges, you know, oftentimes we need to question, you know, go a little further. Is that person using the right instrument? Is it a culturally appropriate instrument that they're examining? What is their awareness, knowledge, and skill set in making those diagnoses? Because when you make any of those types of assessments about someone, there is a level of subjectivity around their perspective. So if we take the consideration that African Americans are often misdiagnosed, we can look at that in terms of offender and those who are actually going into the field. And how many of these people who are psychologists who are actually making this determination, what is their skill set as well? Because we can't assume that when that person is actually making that evaluation, that they have the best skill sets themselves. Historically, if we go back and look at history, mental health has also been used to control as far back as slavery, to try to escape. Try to escape would mean that you had a mental health disorder. And there is a level of issue, you know, concerns about the diagnosis. So not only are we concerned about for African American community, not only are we concerned about are there enough people of color getting jobs in policing, or do they want them at all? But also looking at, on the offender side, how does that person, who is diagnosing that person? And we more concerned in my discipline in corrections about how we put those kinds of labels on people. And then at the same time, once they've been labeled that way, if they've been misdiagnosed, then that means you're not giving a correct intervention for that person as well, or programming for that person. Okay, all right.
This leads to, I think your comments, Dr. Truesdale, lead to another question that was provided here about and I assume all the panelists could speak to this to some extent, is the kinds of efforts that are being made by the university to enroll students of color to enter corrections, criminal justice, and law enforcement programs. And I'll leave it open. I think many of you might have perspectives on this.
I'll jump in. I know that we specifically for criminal justice, law enforcement, and corrections, because we do corrections at the same time, we go recruit in a couple of very specific areas. The Minnesota Police Explorers Conference is one that we go to. This was our first year missing it in like 8 years because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Our academic advisor, Trudy Kunkel, actually goes up to Anoka Hennepin Technical College for an event every fall because they actually have a high school program that goes right into law enforcement. We have tried to get to the LEO conference, which is the Law Enforcement Opportunities Conference. We try to get out there to where we know that there might be a larger gathering of students. We do have connections with our community colleges because that's a natural transition from the ones that are getting their 2-year degree to come and finish their 4-year degree. But that's about the extent that I have right now that we've been doing specific criminal justice program recruiting out in the community. Maybe
what we can do is have the program representatives talk about how their programs recruit, and then we'll hear what the administrators have to say about more broadly recruiting students of color to the university as well. So Dr. Truesdale?
Well, I can tell you our discipline is mostly one where they realize what they want to do once they get into the university and take courses like juvenile delinquency or intro to criminal justice or any one of those intro class. So we're one of those kinds of majors, okay? The second thing that I wish we would do more of is to go to different community colleges and start recruiting. We're at the stage where we're making connections with them, which I think is a good thing. I do believe to recruit students of color, particularly Black and brown students, the university has to do a better job at bringing in faculty that looks like them. And that has been, in the honesty, that has been a challenge. It's just been a challenge trying to hire someone at the university. So I just leave it at that.
I answer some of that as the VP of Diversity and Inclusion. One of my primary responsibilities is to help the university recruit and retain diverse employees and students. We are, I think, fairly good at recruiting students. We need to get better, and we are getting better at retaining those students, because to get here, they have to be able to get that 4-year degree and leave us. We do have some programs that are specifically to try to get diverse students into higher ed and specific programs. And maybe one of those we ought to do. Right now, we have some for diverse students in the sciences. Maybe we ought to do some of these special recruiting for diverse students going into criminal justice, going into policing, going into corrections. So we can and probably should do a better job of doing that, because our communities, again, are saying they would, just like Dr. Truesdale was talking about, the importance of students seeing role models in as their faculty members. Many people in the communities out there say they would love to see police that look like them and think like them in their communities. So that is something we, as a university, can make a commitment to doing different and better, and following up on some of these suggestions that we are talking about.
I also want to jump in here. Like in law enforcement, most of our students come to the university knowing they want to study law enforcement. And that's part of the recruiting connection we need to have with local law enforcement agencies. Most students that want to study law enforcement have had one of those experiences with a law enforcement officer that they idolize, they got a mentor connection, or they want to make things better. I mean, we have a pretty good relationship with the Mankato Department of Public Safety, but we need to be pushing our relationships more outside of Mankato and even with Mankato to help recruit those students, because you influence our law enforcement students in our high schools. We can't do that all as our university, but if we work with our partners in the profession, maybe we could have a better chance of recruiting students in high school, get their interest, get them into some programs where we're working together to build our student population. Because, and I know the next question, I'm just going to answer it here. We at the university reflect the same percentages of women and officers of color that the law enforcement agencies do in the upper Midwest. We're right about 15% for female and about 10 to 11% officers of color. We run almost exactly the same as our law enforcement agencies. So any recruiting efforts they do help us, and any recruiting efforts we do help our law enforcement agencies. And I think that's a partnership we need to explore more. I don't know what that looks like. And I don't know that our law enforcement officers and elected officials know what that looked like, but it's probably a conversation we need to have. We need to be helping each other. We really do.
Can I ask a question of my colleagues on the panel as I was listening to you? Let me say, I'm also learning about our programs here. So I'm also, when we talk about the psychological kind of issues and stuff, do we ask our police to do too much in our correction? That seems like a big kind of issue. For, I have lots of degrees, and I couldn't answer some of these questions that in terms of evaluating. So do we ask our police, and should our programs try to figure that out in our relationship with police, what we ask police to do?
You want to jump on that first, Charisse, or do you want me to?
I think they do. I think that, I was raised on the East Coast, and many people who majored, you have some who majored in criminal justice, some did psychology or social work, just like here. But also some of those individuals came from the Marines or the Army and decided that they wanted to do law enforcement. They're trained to kill. They're trained to use weapons. We're not just talking about a gun that we wear on our holster. We're talking about people who also are used to, use M16s and M60s and, and some also have come through Desert Storm that had gotten law enforcement jobs. And some people who want to work in law enforcement may, have some of their own issues that they have to unravel. Some people may not, who work in law enforcement, really don't know how to work with someone who's dealing with mental health challenges. We can say it all day long. We can just say it all day long in a class, but until you go and have that interaction, you're really not sure what to do. So a trained person should be the one to go in there and probably de-escalate, because they understand those people's challenges more than someone like myself, who's a law enforcement person and I'm trained with to do other things, right? So I think we need to really think about who we sending in to do certain things. And then I would say from a personal note, I have a cousin who just retired last year from law enforcement in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And I asked her when some of our own incidents have happened, I asked her, I said, what kind of questions did they ask you? And she said, before, when you got hired, in the early 90s. And she said, they asked me about a gender question. And the question was, when he goes in, your partner is a male, he goes in to deal with a situation or a crisis. Are you going to sit in the car and you going to go with him? She says, I'm going to go with him because right now we're equal. We're looking out for each other. Right. That's the right answer, right? But she said to me, there was not one diversity question that they asked her in an interview. Not one. And, my concern is at the hiring process, not just what is that person trained to do, but what kind of questions you're asking them to get them prepared to think about some of the issues that they may have to deal with, right? I think that's important. So back to, more specific to the question, I think we ask law enforcement to do too much, right? I do think we ask them to do too much. And every single thing that we come into contact, call the police, call the police, call the police. They could be having coffee and they're not where they're supposed to. Call the police. I think that we ask them to do too much.
So as somebody who is a Midwest girl, grew up Midwest, I was working law enforcement in the Midwest. Yes, we have trained our society over the last 15 to 20 years. If you need anything, call 911. And also we've had our government structure create a system where, okay, so who can answer these 911 calls no matter what? Law enforcement, fire, and emergency medical technicians, right? So you have expanded what's required of law enforcement. And we also have some laws, like the only profession that can put a hold on somebody who's in a mental health crisis and refusing to get help is a law enforcement officer. Even a social worker would have to call a law enforcement officer to take that person against their will to get medical treatment. Mm-hmm. Could we balance out things? Maybe, right? We also have to do assessments of where we think the issues are, what we think are the calls that law enforcement should be going on or maybe shouldn't be going on, and who would be able to do that. There's a lot of thought we need to put into it. I mean, are we going to tell people you can't call 911 for everything, and now this is the only list of things you can call them for? How would we train people to not do that now that we've trained them to call 911 if they need anything? Right? And, our law enforcement officers are not all the same, nor do we ever want them to all be the same. The point is we no longer have what does a perfect law enforcement officer look like, right? Because we want them to reflect everybody in the community. We want them to think differently instead of think all alike. We want them to be able to communicate differently. A challenge is, how do we get more of that? I mean, we have a lot of people that are interested in being in law enforcement that might be, I'm just going to use a stereotype for a second, white males that grew up in the suburbs, so they don't really have exposure to diversity. Well, should we discourage them from following the pursuit of law enforcement because of that? Or can we help give them some education that maybe can help their cultural competency, that may turn them into be a great community officer somewhere? I guess, that's probably my burning question is, how do we take the ones that are interested and want to be a part of it and make them better going into the law enforcement profession, or more equipped, or have more tools, along with making our programs more attractive for those in diverse and underrepresented communities? It's a balance that we need to do, because then we go back to Henry's question, are we expecting law enforcement to do too much? Well, if we have the right people in there, we're not. I don't know. Because we have some great people with military experience that are awesome officers. You would never have known that they were over in Desert Storm, right? But we also need those that haven't been in that mentality.
There was a submitted question earlier related to whether there's a focus in the curriculum on understanding implicit bias and processing experiences with people of color. It seems like that might be a related question.
Well, I would like to answer that. My big thing is, I think that if you have not been raised in a diverse community, and Midwest is not a diverse place at all. It's just not. When I first came here, I had students that say they never had an African-American professor before. So I was news to them, and then moving across the country from the East Coast here, that was news to them. Some had never been on the East Coast, So my encouragement is to have our students, whether they're in the corrections, law enforcement, criminal justice, all three programs, they need to spend time in a diverse community. And not one that they claim to be someone that's going to appease them in some kind of way, what they call a safe space or whatever. No, you need to go to urban America, where you might be patrolling at some point or working as a probation officer at some point, and be a part of that community. Whether it be working in a shelter, whether it be beating a street with someone, whether it be doing some outreach kind of work, they need to go spend time in those communities. I have trouble taking a student from a very, a community where there is no diversity, and then all of a sudden they have to work in a community with diversity, with lots of diversity and cultural activities or values and beliefs that are just the exact opposite of what they have. So it's important that they understand or have a comfort level in interacting. You have a lot, I won't say most, but there are lots of African American students on our campus that come to this space and they're the only person in their class, and they can't relate to anybody. No one's African American in their class. I've seen that many a times, and sometimes I'm the only one in the class. So, but how does that student who is white, how does that person, if they were put in a situation where they were the only white person in the class, how then do you function? What are the experiences that you have? And so they have to get a grip on, if they're going to work in a field that has a high level of diversity. Because when you go into corrections, you have majority Black and brown offenders there. Unfortunately, that's our reality that I wish I could change. But how do you go into a discipline or a profession that looks the exact opposite of you? You say you want to police, but you don't have any experience. So how do we give them that experience in working with this population before they become professional? I think it's crucial.
Dr. Morris, would you like to say something?
Yeah, no, well, I already said it was something I was looking at in the questions, and I was going to ask from an outsider's point of view. And I say, what outsiders, my degrees are not in the majors we're talking about, more but as a consumer of those majors. And that was, what do we see as weaknesses in our programs? And I can tell you, when I first started to ask the question with my colleagues here at the university was, do we have gaps in our program? That was a word I used. Are there things missing there that would give our graduates a better foundation for them to be police? Because again, a lot of things happen to them after they leave us. Mm-hmm. So we can have the best program here, and things still can happen to them after they leave us to move them in a path that we would not like and take honor. Oh yeah, that's a graduate of ours. We wouldn't want to do that. So that was the question. Do we have gaps? And I think that's one of the things we're looking at. And that's why we're asking the community, from community members, from people who may be interested in joining us. Are there gaps when you have interacted with police or with the corrections? There was something that you thought was just amiss that would help us figure out how we do a better wraparound program. How do we look at those gaps? What are they missing? Now, I think there may be some gaps, but you don't know what you don't know until you look at it. And they may actually not be gaps. Again, we don't control everything about people in the criminal justice. So that's one of the things that is we're asking the question, are there? Which I think is the first thing of learning.
Another thing, and I was going to jump on Teresa's there, is part of our job in education should be to give our students a chance to interact positively with a community that's different than theirs. We don't want to just give somebody a degree and send them out into a diverse community, whether it's an immigrant community, a domestic community. If their very first interaction with them is during a crisis, and that's how they build all of their base knowledge of that community is off of a crisis situation, then we're really doing them a disservice. So maybe part of it is doing the public service, or maybe hearing voices different than we joke in a way in our program because we've tried to hire more diverse faculty, but we're all white, right? So our professor that teaches policing in a diverse society, he's really into sociology. He loves the history. He really focuses on implicit bias and systemic racism. But as he says at the end of the day, I'm a white law enforcement officer who's now a professor telling that to my law enforcement students. They need to be hearing that from a voice from a different community as well, and building those images, right? I know we have that as a gap. I have no idea how to correct it or fix it at this point, but they need to be building positive interactions with all sorts of different communities, not just where we come from. And that's true of everybody, not just white people. Mm-hmm. It's true of everybody. And that should be part of our job in higher education, right? Is to help build those interactions and relationships before we send somebody out into the world. To be a part of a global citizenship in a community, we should be able to relate. So, and I wish I knew the magic answer to fix that right now, but that's what we're doing. We're trying to get some ideas to do that. So.
Chris, can I jump in briefly? I think, again, I don't have the magic pathway either, but as things that are coming down the road, we've talked within social and behavioral sciences about building some new structures for collaborations within the college that are really centered around the idea of public service. And the general idea is to, whatever program it has to be, just invite more opportunities for collaboration with other departments, whether or not it's gender and women's studies, ethnic studies, sociology, and then through those collaborations, or making those collaborations easier. I mean, some of them are going on already. And I'd really tip my hat to both Charisse and Pat for their work on criminal justice, because I think that's the best example, most pertinent example right now of that kind of collaboration. But if we can make it easier, then I think that we would say have an opportunity to provide students in law enforcement or corrections with more opportunities, perhaps through another instructor and program, to have those opportunities to engage with outside communities. So we're excited about that. And I think secondly, the other thing that we really have to do as a college and a university is really explain to both potential students and to the community what it is that we actually do. And last year in social and behavioral sciences, we were able to hire a person that specifically can assist faculty in those programs to reach out to potential students with marketing materials. So, it's one thing to get back to recruiting. It's one thing to recruit, but you've got to have a message. And, all of us are very busy in our own professions, and we're not born marketers, most of us. So I think now that we have a person that can assist in that regard, we'll be better positioned to reach out to potential students and also community members to explain what it is that programs such as corrections, criminal justice, and law enforcement actually do.
Dr. Truesdale, did you want to speak to the issue of weaknesses overall?
Yeah.
We were talking about?
What I think we have to, as a university, when it comes to our program, we have to do a better job at hiring Black and Brown faculty who are from domestic. And the reason I say domestic is because this issue is very, very concerning to the African American community and Hispanic community. They've been born here, raised here, and been dealing with this all their lives. I think we have to do a better job at building that kind of community. If you look at the Tinto model, his research talks about when you have faculty of teachers that look like their students, they're more likely to do better at school. The conversations that I have had with my students who are of color in my office have been quite different from those who are white. Some would be, this is what I'm experiencing on my internship. How can I deal with this? Just last year, someone was crying about the racism that she was experiencing on her internship. And I had to have that same conversation with her that my mother had with me. You see? So we have to do a better job at hiring. We have to do a better job at who are we connecting our students to when they're doing an internship. I've heard disastrous experiences that I wish I could go down there to those offices and those agencies and correct, but I can't always do that. I can't always do that at all. One of the reasons why I created, started teaching cultural competency in corrections is because of something that I had witnessed myself in Minnesota. And I vowed I did not want any of my students, Black, brown, white, immigrant, to have to go into a workspace and see that. So how do I make a difference as a professor? How do I make a difference in terms of improving not just their experiences that they have when they get there, but you don't become that professional that I heard. How do I make a difference in that way? So I think about what I can change in my space.
We have two very related questions, I think, to that, Dr. Truesdale. I just want to remind everybody who's with us that to continue to submit questions or raise your hand if you'd like to express them orally. We are scheduled to go till 1 o'clock today. But there are two questions, and they both relate to internships. One question asks about corrections, specifically placing students in internships amid a pandemic. And the other question asks about, is it possible, or would it be appropriate to require a one-year internship in diverse communities for all students? So perhaps we could address these questions.
I'll let Pat go first.
I thought maybe you wanted to talk about how you're doing internships and pandemics. So, but I'll go first here. And
but we can do both of us. I was just didn't want to talk all the time.
Actually, I'll go first here. And I'm at Bess, if you don't mind, I'm going to unmute you. Could you kind of explain what you would think about, what do you think a year-long internship in a diverse community might look like? Because I'd be really interested to hear about that. So I'm going to unmute you if you wouldn't mind talking about that.
You're talking to me?
Oh, no, that was, I'm sorry, the person I allowed to.
Who is that?
Here we go. I think I've got her unmuted here. Unmute. Taylor, I might need your help here.
Is that Bess?
Yes.
Yep, I'm trying to unmute her too. So
hello?
There we go.
Oh, there you are. Hi.
Oh, hi. I had to unmute on my end.
That's all right. So what do you think an internship in a diverse community might look like?
Well, just off the top of my head, it's how about spending a year in North Minneapolis?
Right. Mm-hmm.
See how you can survive, see how you can interrelate, see how you can get along. Or how about, in the Somali community near the U of M, or the Latino communities, or maybe take the Hmong community in St. Paul, or take turns, be in one for 2 months and another one, maybe learning another language. That teaches you a lot about the culture of the community, the sensibilities, the way the community looks at life, which may be really different. And I'm not from the Midwest either originally, and I look at things quite differently than Midwesterners.
Mm-hmm.
So I think you can't learn that. It's kind of like, I know, Chris, you've been in France, so it's like going to France for a year, and you come out a different person because you see that your way is not the only way. And I think we have people who don't travel or who have not spent time in somewhere else, in another community. They think their way is the way. There is no other way. And then they kind of freak out if they go abroad and it's like, oh, we have to use the toilet with a hole in the floor. How do I do this? That kind of thing. Just different experiences. So I think it would be really valuable for students to be immersed, like, I don't know if any of you have seen The Wire on TV. How would you survive as a white person who never had that experience in The Wire, Baltimore?
Mm-hmm.
So I just think it will give people a different perspective, a day-to-day thing, not necessarily being a police officer, but just living, relating, buying your groceries, etc., in another community.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Bess. I'm sorry to put you on the spot, but I wanted to kind of hear what your point is.
Yep. I'm glad she stated that because I lived in Baltimore for 13 years, and that's where I ran my program. And it's very true. I've had to back away from doors before, dealing with some of the population that I was working with. But I am interested in seeing, Beth, how some of our students would actually function there. I had a student here that's from Minnesota that decided to do his internship in Chicago. And he came back after his internship and he said, Doc, you weren't lying, honey, you weren't lying. And, he talked about his experience and all the things. And I said, how'd it work out? And it was the opener for him. It really was. It was something that I can't teach you in a book. I can't teach you at all. You have to go stand in those spaces and figure it out.
And then on the flip side, because I actually bought and rehabbed a house in Jordan neighborhood in North Minneapolis before, while I was in college, and I lived there the first 7 years I was in law enforcement. The flip side of that is you realize your neighbors are people. You realize the people in the neighborhood, which could be multiple blocks, are not all criminals, right? You're only dealing with maybe 3 to 4% of them. And it's easy to lose that perspective if you're working overnight and all you do is go 911 call to 911 call. So I actually think it's a great idea. And I know there's a lot of organizations and agencies that could give both sides of that perspective, right? Where you could go and maybe things are different than you thought, or maybe they're also people that are working and struggling to live and making ends meet, and not everybody's a bad person too. That's our us versus them philosophy that we hear a lot about in the media that we need to try to address.
And I'm glad you said that, Pat, because the thing about it is when we talk about the wire, there was a time when, I had students that just automatically thought that I came from the, I say, quote unquote, urban America. I was raised in rural America outside of Charlottesville, Virginia. So, that's, there are just two different experiences. I can tell you that. I was used to leaving my door unlocked and all this other kind of stuff. But the point that I want to make is what Pat said, that people are people. And there are, for instance, African-American churches in these communities where I went to church in Baltimore that are thriving, very political. These people were, if they weren't the mayor, they were the, assistant to the mayor, or they were teachers, or they were janitors, or they were, they were all walks of life, people who didn't have a job, or the homeless man on the street that decided to come in and worship. So I think that it's important that Pat had said that you see that they are human, and your interaction in those spaces, you'll find that they're still upstanding people who care about their communities. They want to have a drug-free community. They want to have a safe community. They go to church. They go to school. Where I got my master's is not far from the riots that was in Baltimore, literally a block away. So I think that it was important for Pat to say that.
That's actually something we battle a lot in all three programs, is the media influence on what they think is happening. I mean, you look at all the entertainment shows. I mean, if you went off the entertainment shows, every police officer would have been in like 4 shootings and a chase every other week, and every person they arrest is a criminal. And if you would go to California, Watson, Compton, you couldn't do anything. Or even listening to media, North Minneapolis, there's such a large geographic area, and there's such a small percentage of actual crime that occurs there that, yes, I know Sharice does this too. We battle the media all the time. Yep.
I heard Sharice talk about internship all over when she was talking about. Pat, is that currently part of your program, that students have to do some sort of internship?
No, we don't require an internship at this point. It's not so much that we don't think it's valuable, it is. It would be just finding the right internships. Most of them want to do internships in law enforcement agencies, which is good, but that also taxes our law enforcement agencies' ability to host interns. I mean, we have 1 to 2 interns at Mankato Department of Public Safety every year, every semester. We put them in Blue Earth County. The one thing that we do get concerned about is if people require internships up in the metro area. Well, if they live full-time in Mankato, how can they get up to internships? Or if they live full-time up in the metro area and commute to Mankato, balancing that out. It is probably something we need to look at again, though.
Would you think, again, I'm part of the audience is asking the questions, is what about internships is what I think the woman asked, in social services kind of organizations? There are quite a bit of nonprofits in Southern Minnesota Community Organization. So not just police.
Mm-hmm.
You know, would that, and you don't have to answer it now, but something I think as a committee we may want to look at as we evaluate what the program is there a wider range of internships, if that's decided makes sense?
Well,
I put it on the list. I think it's a good one.
if I could respond to Henry, I think that working outside our discipline as an intern, if we were to require a certain amount of time for our internship, because you have to understand how to do the applied stuff that you're being trained to do. Just have to do that. But I think the best thing to understand and learn the community is what Bess was saying, is that go into these communities and learn the culture, because that's where you understand how to interact best. So it could be working at a food shelter. It could be working, a lot of African American churches have programming. It could be something that you're doing with the programming. It could be something that you're working in, not necessarily social work, but some type of service driven where you're interacting with everyday people. It could be inside of a school. It could something where you're interacting with everyday people. If you're working in your discipline, you don't necessarily get that.
We just have a few minutes left, and I know there is general interest around the country, and maybe Dean Loiza has some perspective on this in terms of how internships in the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences generally, for example, are working in an age of pandemic. How is that working for students? Oh, you're muted.
You're muted.
You're muted.
Yeah, I guess in short, I'd say that is a work in progress, and there are, certainly kind of renewed challenges that we need to figure out. Without going into express detail, I guess I'd say in the age of COVID, what we want to do is provide the best experiences for student learning that are possible. So in limited cases, I guess if there is a way to have those internships continue in an online basis, we're pursuing those opportunities, just out of concern for safety on both ends of the spectrum, whether or not it's the student or for the participants in the partner agency. If there really is no way to replicate an internship experience online, then we've worked to develop a clear set of safety protocols that both the partner agency and the program and the student will agree to. They all, expect that all parties will attend to CDC guidelines for social distancing, so forth and so on. So the programs the internships in SBS have followed a wide variety based on basically what might be possible in a face-to-face environment, what might be possible in an online environment, and just take it on a case-by-case basis. So without really getting into the nuts and bolts of all of our programs, I guess I'd start there, and if there's follow-up questions, can certainly field those.
Thank you. We just have a few minutes left. I don't know if Dr. Nelson, if you'd like to close us out. I know we have 3 more of these sessions.
Right.
July 16th, July 20th, and July 22nd, if people are interested.
And I'm always happy, if you have some ideas, I'm always happy to take those ideas too, if you think of them later. Again, we are still looking for people to be part of work groups. And it doesn't have to just be members of urban communities. We're looking for members of all communities in Minnesota. We we have graduates that work in every type of community in Minnesota. That's who we're educating our students for as well. So please, if you're a smaller community, a rural community, we're still interested in what you're thinking as well. Again, we'll be putting out information on if submitting a letter of interest to be a part of the work group. And if you want to join us for the rest of the sessions, you can. It's going to be very similar, though. We're just really opening it up for some feedback and talking about what we do. And if you'd like to join us, or if you want to pass the word, we appreciate that.
Okay, well, thank you very much. All of our panelists are readily available. You can find them online at the university. You could contact them via email or phone if you have any follow-up questions or thoughts. I'm sure they'd appreciate your input as they're evaluating their programs and talking about how they can enhance the educational experiences of our students as well. So thank you very much for joining us today. And maybe we'll see you at a future one, but if not, please do let other people know in the community that they can participate as well. Thank you.